Alrighty, hello everybody. If it's your first time with us today, welcome, and if you've been here before, welcome back. We're bringing you part 4 of the Road to NM series, and today we're going to be looking on busting that slump. We're talking about this last weekend being up in Atlanta here, and had the chance to play 4 games in an action tournament up there. Game 45 was the time control. If you were out for the last video, you saw that in the Southern Open I got swept off the board 3 times in a row. So looking to bounce back and was hoping for a strong showing in this tournament to get back on track. Now, as we go through these games today, we're going to try to highlight some of the critical moments and talk about some of those key psychology concepts. What's going through my mind, especially when I'm coming off of a losing streak? How can we try to right the ship? What sort of things are we thinking about? How are we trying to get our chess back on track? That's what we really want to focus on in today's video. I'm going to show you 4 critical moments from each of the games here, and we'll go through all of the moves, but we're going to kind of gloss over some of the opening moves fairly quickly. That way we can get to those critical moments and talk about what was happening. Now, let's go ahead and kick things off. In round 1, I had a very tough pairing. I got paired against the highest rated guy in our tournament, and that is National Master Ethan Sheehan up in Atlanta, Georgia. Very strong young National Master, rising talent, only 13 years old, and was very excited to get a crack at him, right? I'm always happy to play those strong guys. Let's go ahead and see how the game unfolded. So e4, c6, we had a Caracan. Like I said, we'll go fairly quickly through the opening. d4, d5, knight c3, d takes e4, and knight takes e4. And Ethan played the knight f6 variation of the Caro. Black has a couple options here. Bishop f5 is another popular line. And after knight f6, I went ahead and swapped off this knight. White simply deciding that he's going to mess up black's structure a little bit. Not that it's that big of a concern. And try to keep the move as well. So he's not responding to the attack on his knight by retreating, but making sure to trade off so that white can continue with natural development. E takes f6, knight f3. Also common is bishop f4, so that black's next move, bishop d6, doesn't prevent it, but I decided to take a different approach to developing in this game. Bishop to e2, castles, castles, and then came the move bishop to g4. So putting a little bit of pressure on my knight here, probably ready to put the rook on the e-file and exert some pressure on the bishop, creating a pin there. I played the move h3, simply asking the bishop, all right, are you going to stay on this diagonal and put yourself back in a box, or are you going to retreat? Bishop h5 was played, and I'm not ready to play g4 right away, but it's always something that potentially could come in these sort of positions if I so desire. Rook e1 was played instead. The f-file is very cramped here. Neither one of us is expecting to open this file up, so the rooks both belong on the e-file. Rook e8 from Ethan as well. And then I went ahead and developed my bishop to e3, so just kind of blunting the rook's scope along the e-file altogether, and then I can try to decide on what sort of plan I want to go through from there. How am I going to shape my middle game? Will I look to play with my pieces on the king side somehow, or will I look for queen side expansion by moving my pawns? Knight d7 brings that last piece into the game, and I played the move queen d2, connecting my rooks. And we're starting to enter that middle game phase where we're both going to have to see how we want to maneuver our pieces. Queen to c7 was played from Ethan, and c4. So I decided, you know what? My opponent hasn't done anything to challenge on the queen side yet. I'm going to go ahead and start taking some space. Now, black does have the option of playing a move like f5 here and threatening f4, so that's something that white always has to be wary of in these positions, is he can't give black that free rein to start getting some kingside play going himself. Rook a to d8 was played, and then b4, taking a lot of space on that queen side from white. Black responded with b6, trying to sort of slow down that queenside expansion. And here, perhaps I made a little bit of an accuracy. It might be nicer to just move a rook over to the center, contest things that way. Maybe even g4 here, just kicking the bishop out and slowing down some of these f5 possibilities since that's in the air. But I played a4. I was going for this queenside expansion, trying to take all the space over here. You see how white has these nice queenside pawns. Maybe I'm going to play a5, start trying to create some weaknesses that way. And now my opponent finally unleashed the move f5, right? Coming for this f4 square, threatening to trap the bishop on e3. And we reach a fairly critical middle game moment. I have to decide how to react. So there's really two options here for white. You can make a move that will either move the bishop away, so we could play something like bishop g5, diving it into the position, though of course there's things like f6 that could happen in that moment. We can play a tactical idea like c5, or we could retreat the queen, play a move like queen to c3, so that after f4 we can drop the bishop back. In general, I don't love to move backwards if we don't have to, right? If a move like queen to c3 or queen to b2, allowing f4 just kind of makes us step back a little bit, and black has gained some nice space on the king side. Of course, things are still objectively even. I'm still trying to press on my queenside expansion, but I've had to take a move to retreat this bishop, and I never like doing that if I don't have to. This is perfectly fine and sane way to play. I decided to go for the tactical shot. I liked c5, and what I really want to talk about here is when we're calculating tactics. And this was something we talked about in an earlier video. Sometimes we get that chess blindness. We get zeroed into certain lines. And I played the move c5. And c5 begins a very long and forced variation, which leads to some crazy complications. And we have to calculate precisely when we go into these sort of things. And the problem with c5 is that, remember, this rook is in line with this queen. So black can look for ways to clear out all the pieces here. So when I played c5, the line I calculated, and we'll go ahead and show this as it plays out, but what I had looked at were the moves b takes c5, b takes c5, knight takes c5, offering the sacrifice, but opening up some of these lines. So after knight takes c5, d takes c5, and then bishop to h2 check, unleashing the rook's attack on the queen. So knight would take on h2, so we've got a bishop and a knight. Then rook will take on d2, and then the bishop will take on d2. This is what I had calculated. So I'm going to lose my queen, but in exchange, I'm going to get the bishop, the knight, and the rook. There will also be a trade of pawns that happens as well. I think I lose a pawn in there as well. So I'll give up a queen and a pawn for a bishop, a knight, and a rook. That's a pretty good trade-off. I'm okay with that. We're getting good compensation for the queen, 2 minor pieces, and a major for it. However, what did I forget at the very end of all that? And we'll see as we go through this variation what was the problem that I had with this. Perhaps you've already seen it. See if you can spot it, and we'll show you as we go here. So c5 was played, b takes c5, b takes c5, knight takes c5, d takes c5, bishop to h2 check, knight takes h2, rook takes d2, and now, wait a minute, what's going on here? Remember, when we looked at that line before, we said, we're going to play bishop takes d2, and we will have gotten a rook, a knight, and a bishop for the queen. But what happens if we play bishop takes d2 here? Well, I played this in the game almost without thinking, and it's not even that hard to find the better move here, but I played the move bishop takes d2, and what does black do? Well, of course, bishop takes d2. I totally forgot because the knight had moved and the bishop had moved when I was calculating that line from 5-6 moves ago, that now both the bishop and the rook are opened up to the e2 square. So black plays bishop takes e2, and now it's only a knight and a rook that I have for a queen. Not a knight, a rook, and a bishop, which is much different, but just the knight and the rook, and this is going to be losing for white. This is going to be a much worse game, much harder to defend. And this is one of those moments. If we go back just a move, remember, looking at this position, what's white's best move here? Well, here, of course, you don't want to take the rook because then you're going to lose the bishop, so you're basically giving up an exchange, whereas instead you can just play bishop takes h5. And after bishop takes h5, black's going to have to move his rook away, something like rook to d3 or rook back to d8, wherever he wants to put it. Let's just play rook d8 for the sake of it, and maybe bishop back to f3. And now you'll see white has 3 minor pieces for the queen. And a pawn as well, though it's a doubled pawn. White's certainly not better in this position, but white's no longer losing anymore either. This is a very playable game for both sides. It's going to be dynamic. Black's going to try to find some way to maybe use this pawn, maybe try to get an attack going on the king side, but white still has a lot of defensive pieces which he can use to try to hold this position. And that's not a very hard move at all to find from this position after rook takes d2. Of course, here the best move is bishop takes h5, but what happened? What happened was I was locked into that line I looked at from 5 moves ago. I didn't even think about anything else, didn't even consider it, because I was so locked into what I had looked at however many moves ago when I calculated 1 move short. And this was something that had happened in some of our previous games from the Southern Open as well. I calculated things and was wrong, and I misevaluated the very final position. However, make sure as you're going through your combinations, still check yourself, because that has been my downfall in a couple of these games. And once again, after this, Ethan played very nice, a very good technical win from him, showing how to destroy my position over the next few moves. We'll go through a little bit just to show you how things go here. But there's a lot of threats for white. He's got a lot of pressure on the position. The pawn wants to come in, and of course I'm already down material. I try to unwind this knight with knight f1, queen to d7, bishop f4, trading off a piece, and rook ad1 is trying to gain a little tempo, improve the position of my rooks before recapturing. Bishop d3 forces off the trade of rooks, and we get this position now where it's rook and bishop against queen and pawn. There's still some back rank ideas, but black is going to get rid of those very quickly. Queen e1 was played, king h2, h6 clears the back rank of threats. Rook d8, king h7, rook d7. I tried desperately to get some sort of counterplay, because I'm going to have to do something to avoid the queen just destroying my position. But the problem for white here is that there's too many weaknesses. a4, b5, and f2 all are too much to defend. If, for example, these pawns could be traded off the board, and white only had to defend on the king side, this would be a much more tenable position. It'd be a lot easier to try to hold. But as it stands, there's just too much for white to deal with. After queen takes f2, I have to deal with the bishop, so it moves away. And a very nice move here from my opponent that I thought, king to g6. If I could take this pawn on f7 and stop the f4 pawn or the f5 pawn from being able to push down the board and create weaknesses, I would love that. I'd be very happy for him to try to keep his a pawn and let me take on f7. After this, I have to take the a7 pawn to try to get any sort of counterplay, and the problem, of course, is that my rook is in front of the pawn for one, and now my rook is far away from the defense, so black has a free hand to get his attack going. f4, threatening f3, so king h1 has to be played here because f3 would pin the g2 pawn. King h1 and f3 comes anyway. Everything is busting up and falling to pieces. All of my pawns are going to fall here on the king side, and very soon the game will come to a close. King h5, very nice, bringing his king in as the last attacker here in order to finish off the job, the queen holding the f7 pawn. Very nice win here from Ethan. I tried desperately to bring my rook back to defense. Rook b7, pawn comes to g5, and the problem is there's just too many forking ideas. There's not even good ways to bring this rook back, because if you bring it down to b3, there are ways for him to step his queen over and eventually fork the rook. So I just can't bring that rook back to help well enough. a5 is played instead, queen to e1, king g2, and then f5. And these pawns and queen are going to be too much for me to deal with. One last cheap shot, though, bishop f8. As long as you see an idea, play it, right? Let's target this g6 pawn. If I could magically plot my rook there, that'd be checkmate. What a happy finish that would be. but there's no way to get it there. After f4, even if you play the move rook h7, queen to e4 will fork that king and the rook, and things fall apart quickly. Rook e7 is played, queen to g3 check, king f1, and after f3, I threw in the towel here because queen g2 is inevitable, moves like f2 and f1 to follow, and no way of stopping these threats. So very nice technical win from Ethan after the tactics played their way out earlier. Big takeaway though, make sure that as you're going through those combinations, pause, stop yourself, reevaluate your assessment of things, because sometimes we get locked into that. So that was my first round game, and after this first round, of course, that puts me on 4 consecutive losses, 3 from the Southern Open, the 4th one here in the 4th round in Atlanta. So I needed to find a way on the board. I needed to find a way to get going again. And my next game, I got the black pieces, which is always one of those where you go, well, now I've got black, I'm in a slump. How can I try to right the ship here? So I stuck to my preparation, I stayed in lines that I knew, and I still maintained confidence. I felt good with my play. Things are just that little bit off, so we need to find the way to push it over, push through, and not let up. Keep the pedal to the metal. My opponent in this game was Benjamin Cartoon, another Class A player in the 1900s, very strong opponent, and here we got a French defense coming up. And once again, we're not going to spend a ton of time in the openings. We'll talk very briefly about it, but I want to look more at an endgame position in this one. So we're going to go fairly quickly through what's going on here. Knight c3, we see a Steinitz variation. Well, rather a McCutcheon is what happens in this game. After bishop to g5 and bishop to b4. And we get a rather fun game going on as a result of this. e5 is played, and the idea for black, this looks like you're losing your knight, right? The bishop is pinning it, and it's attacked, but we're going to counterattack with h6. So if you play the move e takes f6, I take this pawn, f takes g7, and rook g8, and even though it looks like black has stopped himself from castling, which is very true, and white is temporarily up a pawn, black is going to win this pawn back with moves like queen f6 and taking there, and this structure in the center is still very tough for white to break. This is very sound for black to play in this way, even though it might look a little bit awkward. Things like queen h5 are tried a lot of times. h4 is another try for white. Lots of different moves here in this position. But the point is that black is maybe going to mess up white's structure on the king side. He still has this pin on the knight. And there's going to be nice counterplay. My opponent didn't go for this line. Instead, after the move h6, he retreated his bishop, which is another standard idea in the McCutcheon, though rather than play it to d2, which you see more often than not to relieve the pin on the knight, my opponent played bishop c1. And this is more of a sideline within the opening. It's perfectly playable, but after bishop c1, knight e4, of course, piles on the pin on white's knight without having done anything to prevent it. Now, white's idea here is to be aggressive. He's going to play queen to g4, attacking my g7 pawn. The point being that if I take here with check, after taking and knight takes, then my rook will be able to take on g7. So if we play check, takes, and knight takes, he can play queen takes g7 with very scary looking attacks. This is not the way black wants to play this position. And if we take with the knight, though it looks like it's setting up some nasty ideas over here, there's not enough of a follow-up. Queen takes g7 immediately is going to be strong enough to defend because of the threats against h8. So even something like knight e4 check, well, now white can just defend with c3. And you're going to either have to sack over here or retreat the bishop and give up the rook. So either one of these is not going to work very well. Black has to do something about this threat to the g7 pawn. He can't just bust forward trying to break through on g3. So I played the move g6. Very calm, simply keeping things solid on the king side. The rook is defending the h6 pawn, and a lot of times in this position, black is really going to delay castling if he ever even does, because this structure is starting to look a little airy over here, and of course if you castle, bishop takes h6 is always in the question. But since white has closed the center, in the French it's very common for black to keep his king in the middle of the board and not have to worry as much about an assault against the king in the center. So g6 is played, and white's idea now is to play the other knight to e2 to deal with the pin. So I played the move c5, very common in the French, going to undermine white's center that way. And white played the move a3. And here there's really two main ideas. You can either take immediately, or you can retreat the bishop to a5. Taking immediately is the more main line. I played the move bishop a5, though you do have to be very careful here, because after white plays d takes c5, he's threatening to play b4, defending the c5 pawn and kicking the bishop. So in this position, it's important that, okay, you retreated for one move, but then after he takes, now you have to dive in and take yourself. And this may look awkward. Why delay the capture if you're simply going to do it on the next move? Well, the point is I kind of wanted to ask him to play d takes c5, because after these trades, my opponent took with the b-pawn rather than the knight, and then trading again and then taking with the b-pawn. After these trades, these pawns are very weak. I mean, look at white's structure. e5 is not protected, c5 is not defended, and there's triple isolated pawns on the c-file. So even though white is temporarily up a pawn, black has targets galore, a lot of things to attack here. And two moves here, the better one is probably knight to d7. I played queen to c7, attacking the pawns this way. Knight d7 is another nice way of putting pressure on the position. Queen to g3, white decides to defend his e5 pawn, and again knight d7 would be a very nice way to continue that attack and continue to put pressure on. I decided to immediately take a pawn back with queen takes c5, and my opponent played the move which I thought was a little inaccurate here. He played bishop to b2. So he could choose between bishop b2 or bishop d2 to defend this c-pawn against some of the mounting pressure. And the problem with bishop b2 is it's a little more airy, right? Nothing is defending it over here on this square, so it doesn't quite look like it's in the right place. We don't have a way to tactically take advantage of it just yet, but we might as things continue to develop. So I played the move bishop d7, simply trying to improve the position. A lot of times black is desperate to try to get this bishop out in the French, and he has a very nice way of bringing it to b5 here and bringing it out to this diagonal to trade it off already in this game, because white is so tied up to defending this c3 pawn. My opponent played knight to c1 because temporarily, right, he's defending this c3 pawn twice, and this brought about a tactical moment. How can black take advantage of the fact that this knight has retreated to the c1 square? I thought knight d4 would have been better if he was going for this idea. He's aiming for the b3 square, trying to reroute his knight there via c1. I thought knight d4 was a better way to accomplish that, because by playing knight c1 you allow d4 from black. The pawn is pinned to the king by the bishop. Now there are 3 attackers on it, only 2 defenders, and black is going to be able to round up this pawn. So after knight b3, even though you're forking the queen and the bishop, black is taking with check. So bishop takes c3. Queen takes c3 was played by my opponent. I'm sorry. After bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3. Queen takes c3, and then queen takes c3, d takes c3 was played. So we got this position here. And black is now up a pawn. He's managed to come out of the opening up a pawn, though it's not so easy to mobilize, right? You're up this b pawn. White has 2 weaknesses, but it's not so easy to target the c2 pawn because your b pawn's in the way. The bishop is going to be able to come to c6, which is nice. You've found a way to get your bad bishop out. So black is very comfortable. I was certainly happy with this. However, converting the game is going to be another story. It's going to be difficult to find a way to break through, because this is not the easiest position to create a passed pawn with white's pawns here on the A and C files. Bishop d3 was played. The bishop came to c6, and then castles. Knight came to d7, so developing with tempo, attacking the pawn. Rook fe1. Bishop d5. Of course, if my opponent will let me, I'll be very happy to play bishop takes b3 and create this passed pawn on b6. I would certainly love that. Knight d4 came, preventing that, and I played a6, taking control of b5, not allowing any ideas of this knight coming in and dreaming of getting to d6 or c7. f4 from white, knight to c5, and bishop to e2, and you see how black is finding ways to slowly improve the position. We're getting in these moves, gaining some space, improving our knight, getting our bishop onto good squares. Everything is looking very nice for the time being. King to e7, connecting the rooks. Rook a to b1, putting pressure down the b file, though of course the knight is holding the square. Rook h d8 puts the rook onto the other open file. Bishop f3 now, and now I have to make a decision. Am I going to trade off these bishops? Well, there's not really a good way to keep them on the board, so yes, bishop takes f3, and knight takes f3, so we're heading toward that endgame. I have gotten rid of my quote-unquote bad bishop, though it was on a good square, so it really wasn't so bad anymore. And now the move b5, simply securing this pawn so that the knight no longer has to defend it. And a4 can't be played to undermine, of course, because of knight takes a4 here. So this knight on c5 is becoming a real monster in the position. I have created a small hole on d6 here, though the knight can't recome to d4 just yet until a rook comes to contest it. So my opponent played the move rook b4, looking to bring a piece onto the d4 square that way. I played rook to d5, preparing to double rooks, also moving my rook out of the forks on the c6 square, so now after knight d4, it's not threatening a fork, just a check, which isn't so bad, and I can play a move like rook to c8 as well if I so desire. And my opponent played rook to d4 here, which I thought was a very nice move, asking to trade off the rooks, but more importantly, allowing him to double on the d file. So after rook a d8 and rook e d1, black does not get complete control over the d file, which is what I would really love to have. If I could get that, that would be enough to break through and have a decisive winning advantage. And here, I perhaps played in inaccuracy a little bit. Simply trading off is going to be just fine, taking all of the rooks. If you trade off the rooks and knight d4 and king to d7, it's going to be a nice ending for black. Instead, I thought to myself, you know what, the rooks are probably going to come off. Let's see if we can improve our knight a little bit first. And I played the move knight to e4. And the problem with knight to e4, my idea is that I'm bringing it more toward the center, and after the rooks come off, I'm preventing your king from going to f2, so it's going to slow you down a little bit. The problem is that my knight is now 2 diagonal squares away from the c2 pawn, which means it's about as far away from being able to attack this pawn as possible. It's going to take at least 3 moves to be able to attack white's weakness on the c2 square. Furthermore, I'm also at least 2 turns away from being able to attack the a3 pawn, and I could only do that with knight d2 and then c5 or going to the a b1 square. So I'm at least 2 turns away from attacking the weakness on a3 and 3 turns away from attacking the weakness on c2. So even though it's quote-unquote improving the knight, I'm still quite a ways away from being able to make a decisive breakthrough here. So after the rooks do start to trade off, rook takes d5, rook takes d5, rook takes d5, I also have to make a minor concession to my structure with e takes d5, whereas if I simply initiate the trades on the d4 square, I keep my pawn islands nice and secured. And in this position, it's true this pawn is maybe connected to these ones, but not in a very useful manner. It's essentially an isolated pawn because of its backwardness. So I've weakened my structure a little bit unnecessarily, and this starts to move things a little bit more back to even. King f1 is played, king to d7, and after king e2, a5, I'm trying to get these pawns pushing because I need to create some sort of mobility in order to win this game. These knight and pawn endgames are very tricky. The general theory behind them is that you want to evaluate them like you would a king and pawn endgame, with the exception that with the knights on the board, they become more drawish, because if the opponent can trade off all of his pawns, he has the potential to sack that knight for your last 1 or maybe even 2 pawns if he gets the chance, and still secure a draw. So it's not so easy to be able to convert these sort of games. King d3 is played, b4, a takes, and I'm trying to want to mobilize with b3, but the problem is my pawn is being blockaded, right? He's controlling that b3 square, his king is in a nice place, and I just really need to find a way to improve a little bit. Knight d4 was played, and knight c5 from black, and then came king e3. And this is really the critical moment that I wanted to share with you guys in this game. You've reached this knight and pawn ending. We've lost 4 games in a row, right? We really need to find a way. We'd love to win this if we can, but I also wanted to make sure that we're not allowing our opponent counterplay. And when we look at this structure, it doesn't seem so easy to be able to play b3 at any point in time just yet. However, white doesn't have great ideas as well. White needs to generate counterplay, and how will he do that? Well, white would generate counterplay with moves like g4, f5, and e6 if he can. He has to expand with his majority on the king side. And the problem is I don't want to give him the chance to do that. And here I missed a very nice move that would really slow down all of white's play. What I should have played here is the move h5, which doesn't look like it's accomplishing a lot for black. It's not pushing forward with the position, but what it's doing is it's preventing this g4 idea. It's making sure that white isn't able to play that. And if white prepares it with a move like h3, for example, black can even play the move h4, which may look odd because you're sort of isolating this pawn over here. It seems like it could become a target after something like knight to f2. But the problem is white doesn't really have time to do this. This h4 pawn becomes a bone in his side. He can't play g4. And if you play a move like knight to f3, then black is going to be able to start pushing some of the pawns over here because you're getting deflected too far away. Maybe it doesn't work just yet, but you improve a little bit, so a move like king to c7, and of course if you go too far away with knight takes h4, now your knight is really far away on the edge, and black can start mobilizing with a move like b3, and you're not going to be able to stop my d and c pawns from working together to run up the board very quickly and win this game. So h5 was a critical move here that I did not play in the game, and because of it, we see white able to mount a very nice defense here. Instead, I played the move knight to e6. So I offered the trade of knights, because of course if I can go into this king and pawn ending, I will be able to win it up a pawn, always with threats of breakthroughs on b3, and with easy paths for my king to come into the game and start undermining all of white's pawns. This is just going to be too much for the white king to deal with. He can't even run over to take on c4, because this d5 pawn is protecting that c4 square. So he has to keep the knight on the board, with knight b3. And after king to c6, problem is there's not a good way for black to make progress in this. It looks like I want to bring my king up and try to push and break through, but there's not a good way to achieve this. So white rightfully plays the move g4, activating his own majority. And the point is, if I start marching my king up the board too far, then white is going to be able to create his own passed pawn, and I'm going to get tied down to defending that and not have enough to break through with my own majority. This is why that move h5 was so important. Knight to c5 was played, again offering that trade, which of course my opponent does not accept. Knight comes back to d4 with check, and here I played the move king back to d7. Simply keeping the flexibility with my king. We can't go forward. That's not going to work. So d7 keeps the options of going to the king side or the queen side open. After h4, we see that white is mobilizing very quickly, and I'm unable to find a way to break through in the position. Knight e4 was played, f5. I played the move h5, trying to undermine some of white's pawns, seeing if maybe I could fix an h4 weakness and maybe navigate my knight around to be able to catch that. My opponent captured on h5, and after g takes h5, f6 from white was a little bit inaccurate as well, and this comes very close to giving me chances again, because of course it's much harder for white to play this e6 push now. Knight to c5 was again played, helping to secure the e6 square. And after knight to e2, king to e6, it looks like black is getting in, but of course white is setting up forks as well. So black defends his e5 pawn. He's preparing knight to f5, attacking h5. My knight comes to d7, that way I can scoop up a pawn myself. Knight f4 check, king to f5, knight takes on d5. My knight takes on e5, and suddenly we see all the pawns are starting to fall on both sides of the board. My last hope is that if you take both of these pawns, I'll take both of these pawns, and I at least have 2 to your 1, so I can sacrifice this knight for your last guy if need be, and still have 2 chances to win the game. Knight takes b4, knight f3 check, choosing to capture the h4 pawn with the knight so that my king can still come and gobble up f6. King e3, knight takes h4, knight d5, and knight to g6. And here my opponent does decide to trade off those pawns, knight takes c3, and king takes f6. And it looks like, once again, maybe I'm going to have a chance to break through in this position. But what's so very difficult about these endings? Well, remember, white always has that ability to sacrifice the knight for these pawns to try to hold the position. And part of the problem here for black is that your pawns are only separated by 1 square. And the knight can move to a square which will create a blockade because of that. So white has some defensive resources. In general, the further apart these pawns are in the knight endings, the better it will be for the side who's better, who's trying to push for the win. They want more space between them because the knight can't defend very far apart pawns very well. Knight e4 was played, king comes to e5, the knight goes to g5 and then f5, so my pawns are getting mobilized here. Of course, white has his own pawn that I may have to worry about at some point. Knight to f3 check, king goes over to d5, keeping the flexibility. Maybe I'll deal with the pawn, maybe I'll come over to this side, and making sure I'm far away from any knight checks. Knight went back to g5 and h4, so slowly we're trying to make progress here, but it's still not very easy to break through. It looks like we're making progress, it looks like we're slowly pushing, but white has lots of defensive resources. King to f3, king comes to d4, knight e6 check was played, and here in this position, king e5 is probably one of the better moves, simply going back toward the pawns and kicking the knight back around, but I made the decision to play king c3. I went for this last pawn. My idea was simply that I want to make sure that I don't do anything to lose this game, right? I'm coming off of 4 straight losses, but unfortunately king c3, when you move the king away from your own pawns, this is going to give white the chance to start creating threats and trade them off, and that will move the game closer to a draw. King e5 was really needed in order to start to keep pushing to try to play for that win. King c3 was a move which was based around the idea of, I just want to make sure I don't lose. I want to get a point on the board. It's been 4 straight losses. And after king to g2, f4 is played, knight comes to g5, and you can see how white is blockading both of these squares here. It's very hard for white, or for black, to make any progress in this sort of position. I took the pawn, and at this point in the game, even for the last 5 moves or so, both me and my opponent were in very big time control, both under 1 minute on the clock. So these moves were played very quickly. We're both rattling things off, and that was part of my decision to go ahead and take this pawn on c2, was also so that, hey, you know, even if I flag here, my opponent's not going to have sufficient mating material. So I want to make sure that I don't end up losing for any reason at all if need be. King f3 was played, and here I tried to sneak my king around with king to d1. None of these ideas are really working, of course. My opponent offered a draw before I played king d1. I decided to play it anyway just to see what he would do. I expected the move knight h3 here, going to trade everything off, because if I try to sneak around, after knight takes pawn, knight takes knight, and king takes knight, black is too slow to be able to come and help this pawn. So king f2, king g4, and white will get off the last pawn. Easy draw in that position. However, rather than playing the move knight h3, my opponent played king to g4, which I felt was something that at least made it interesting for me to try. So I decided to keep pressing a little bit more. King to e1 was played. The knight came back to h3, and then I played the move f3, and the point was, of course, now he was trying to round things up, and there's really nothing else I can do. So king g4 was still perfectly fine. He's now bringing the knight in to attack. I don't have a good way of dealing with the pawn over here, so I played f3, and after king takes f3, we agreed to a draw. So very hard-fought game in that one. We finally got back on the board a half point, right? Not the most exciting thing in the world to draw, but we managed to play a nice game. I mean, it was a game where we won that pawn. We couldn't quite find the way to convert it, but of course, it's always nice to be better, be playing those two result positions where you're going to win or draw, as opposed to being on the back foot like I have for the last 4 games. Well, remember, today's theme is not just drawing your way out of the slump, it's busting the slump. We don't want to just be drawing games, we need to win them. And still in this game, 2 rounds down, and I've only got a half point, so that's a -1 score going into round 3. I need to right the ship. I'm trying to get back on track. Finally got the white pieces here, and in round 3, I played Mr. Kabalesh Yuvaraj and had a chance to play a very nice game here. We'll go through the opening again fairly quickly so we can get to some of those key strategical points and ideas, talk about some of the mental framework of what's going on. But in this game, we got a King's Indian attack against a French. It was transposed in kind of a weird way. E6 and D5 were played, and we got this King's Indian attack setup where white fianchettos the bishop, the knights are on D2 and F3. Black expands in the center here, and typically in these positions, white plays on the king side, black plays on the queen side, but sometimes things change a little bit as well, and here black played the move D4, which is a little bit premature in these sort of positions. And the problem with D4, which I overlooked in the game, but the big problem with D4 is it allows white to play the move E5. So both sides are going to take their space and make their stake in the center. And in these King's Indian attacks, typically white is very happy to let the center close. And the reason being that white wants to try to create an attack on the king side if he can. So by closing off the center, it's going to slow down any of black's counterplaying ideas on the queen side because it takes a lot of moves to start getting them going. When the center still has a lot of tension, it's often hard to start a wing attack because, well, your opponent can strike in the center and you don't want him to get a big central attack going at the expense of you only being able to play on a portion of the board. So E5 I did not play. Instead I castled kingside, and this allows my opponent to play the move E5. It's still perfectly sound, but you see now that black is the one with a little bit more of a spatial advantage. White's a little bit more cramped in this position. Knight C4, putting pressure on the E5 pawn. Bishop D6 was played, and here A4 is a positional idea trying to secure this B5 square so that black can't kick my knight off of C4. It's perhaps a little bit unfounded because, of course, black can still challenge me with things like Bishop E6. Black castled, Bishop G5 was played, H6, and in this position I traded off bishop for knight. Another one of those sort of positional ideas where I like this knight on the c4 outpost. By trading off the knight, it gets rid of one of the pieces which can contest that c4 knight, which is, of course, his knight over here. My dark squared bishop can't do anything to sit on c4, so I'm okay with trading off a piece which can't occupy the outpost for one that can contest it in order to try to secure this. But of course, bishop e6 will still challenge that, so I have to try to figure out what I'm going to do with that. I played the move knight h4, trying to head in for f5 and prepare some f4 breaking ideas. Bishop to c7 was played, moving the bishop out of the knight's attack. And here I played the move queen to e2, which is perhaps a little bit inaccurate, giving black some shots. You can see that white's position feels a little hairy. It doesn't feel like I've quite developed right in this game. Bishop e6 really puts the question to my c4 outpost that I've been trying to create. Knight d2 was what I played, simply retreating for now and saying, hey, you know what, I'm going to come back here at a later time after I deal with your e6 bishop. Knight to b4 was played from my opponent, attacking the c2 point, but I think it's a little bit premature. After the moves c3, d takes c3, and b takes c3, this knight doesn't have anywhere great to go, and after the knight comes back to c6, it's true that black gets this open d file to attack on, but for the time being, it's protected once, and we can always bring more over there. There's no pressure on it just yet. And white has this knight that wants to come back to c4, this knight that's eyeing c5, and there's a nice dynamic equality going on. So at this point I played rook a to b1, aiming on the b file, and here my opponent made his first mistake, which really started giving me some chances in this game. So I thought my opponent would play the move either rook a b8 or b6 here, simply shutting down the attacks on the b file. Instead, my opponent played bishop b6. And the problem with bishop b6 is that, yes, it closes off my rook's attack, but it sort of pins your bishop to that. It also puts your bishop behind the c5 pawn. Of course, you're threatening to push with c5, so if I play my f4 break, which is something that looks like I've been preparing, if I play f4, black can meet it with this move c4, discovering the check on the king. And this doesn't look very nice for white at all. But there's nothing that's prompting white to push f4 in this position. And there's a couple different ideas. I mean, if I would like to be able to play a move like c4 here, or knight to c4, and simply say, hey, this c-pawn isn't moving at all, and now your bishop's on a silly diagonal. Though here it does allow his bishop to trade, and we would get this isolated pawn situation. I've got a lot of pawn weaknesses. At least they're helping to control the center. I get the d and b files for my rooks. This is a sort of equal-looking game. I really don't think that white's structure makes him that much worse because he has these dynamic ideas with this bishop being pinned. However, I don't necessarily want to go for that if I don't have to. Instead, what I played was a different way of handling the dynamics, and that was the move knight to f5. Knight f5 makes a very big question for my opponent. If you do not take the knight is going to come to e3, and then one of these two knights will come and occupy the c4 square, where they'll both support each other and continue to put pressure on your awkwardly placed bishop. So you want to do something about this knight, because if you let it come to e3, that just looks nice and positionally sound for white. However, if you take the knight, which is what happens in the game, after bishop takes knight and pawn takes bishop, white's position is totally freed up. This bishop is no longer on e6, so my knight can come to c4, maybe even to e4. The bishop is now opened up on the long diagonal, and this g2 bishop becomes a monster in the position, creating all sorts of tactical threats. And all of this at what looks like the cost of a pawn after queen takes f5, but even after queen takes f5, it's only a temporary pawn sacrifice, because knight to c4 immediately attacks this bishop 2 times. There's no way for black to defend the bishop. There's no pieces he can bring to add more defense to the square. If he moves the bishop away, you can play rook takes b7. So this isn't even a sacrifice of a pawn. It's a temporary pawn sacrifice. You're immediately going to get one back if you so choose to take it right away. And suddenly white's pieces are just beautiful. The bishop is eyeing the knight, the pawn, and the rook along this diagonal. A lot of pressure on the b6 bishop. So where did black go wrong here? I mean, if we went back 5 moves, white looked like he developed pretty awkwardly in the open. Things weren't really working correctly, and suddenly the position has unwound, and now white is completely alive. Well, rook a d8 was played from my opponent. I played rook fd1, securing up that d3 square, and this is one of those moves where sometimes, even though you see fun tactical ideas, right, I'd love to take the bishop, pawn takes, rook takes, and we could go into these crazy lines with like rook takes d3, bishop takes b7, but sometimes rather than going for these sharp, very unclear things, it's nice to take just a move to secure everything, tighten up, and ask your opponent what they're going to do. If your opponent doesn't have good ways to continue to improve the pieces, you can always retain your threats and just slowly build. And that's what's happening in this game. Black doesn't have good ways to unwind his pieces. There's no clear plan for black to bring things to more active squares. This knight doesn't have anywhere good to go. The bishop is pinned to this b7 pawn. The queen is about as active as it can be. The rook is about as good as it possibly can be. So my opponent played rook d7, trying to prepare to double rooks. And now is the time where I can take that pawn back. Knight takes a6, a takes b6, and rook takes b6. So my opponent played the move rook f to d8, and the problem is that I have another way to defend with bishop e4. So even though you've doubled the rooks on this d-file, it looks like you're getting some nice pressure against d3. Bishop e4 says, nuh-uh-uh, all of your plans of attacking on this d-file are null and void. Your queen has to retreat, and my bishop is defending this d3 square. So now came a moment in the game where I had to make a decision between whether to continue to improve my position with a move like rook db1 and allow my opponent to play f5, because if I play rook db1, my opponent will be able to play a move like f5, and after moving the bishop, I'm going to have to take it in order to avoid this d3 pawn falling. But black is going to start getting a lot of pressure down along the d-file. White is still up a pawn. There's still ways of dealing with things or creating more pressure in the position. You also have this passed a pawn. But basically, white is going to play with the passed a pawn. This would be one option here. Move the rooks over to the b-file and play to win with your a passer. Or you can take another approach, which would be to stop f5. So I made the decision, I don't want my opponent to play f5. I like these rooks being shut out of the d-file. I like the bishop defending d3. And I played the move queen to h5. And the point behind queen h5 is we're defending this f5 square, stopping that f5 push. And of course, we're also putting some pressure on his position as well, eyeing squares like f7 and e5. There are some nasty tactics here too. You may ask, why not play the move queen to f3, right? We're defending f5, and now we have 3 attackers on this knight, putting a ton of pressure on the position. Well, queen f3 fails to knight d4, a surprising tactical shot from black, always having to look out for those tactical shots of our opponents. The point is, of course, now the queen is attacking the rook as well. So if we take the knight, the queen can take the rook. And if we take the queen, then the knight will take our queen with check, and after we recapture, our rook falls anyway. So we don't want either of these things to happen in this position. And of course, we cannot move our queen to f3. We also can't keep our queen on e2 because of this. These threats are abounding in the position. So queen to h5 was played. Rook db1 would have been the other way to stop those ideas because you're adding the defense. But of course, we mentioned the f5 and the d3 pressure. And my opponent played the move queen a2, going for counterplay. And this is what queen h5 allows. It allows my opponent to be able to gobble up this a4 pawn. However, I'm able to double my rooks on the b-file. Remember, we've closed up the center over here. But black once again had one more tactical shot. I did overlook this in the game. In the post, we were able to find this with a little bit of analysis. And this was the one shot my opponent missed to try to get back into it, because otherwise, white is really swarming the black pieces, going to slowly squeeze this position to death. The shot my opponent missed was knight to b4. What a move here. Knight b4, interference on the rooks, and the only way for white to try to keep an advantage is to do a discovery of his own with d4, discovering the bishop's defense on the b1 rook and threatening the knight by offering to take it. But of course, doing this is going to blow apart white's center. The center is going to fall to pieces, and black's rooks are going to come alive. This is going to give him some chances for counterplay after a move like knight to d5, for example. The center is about to explode here, even though we're able to take on the b7 square. Black is going to be able to open up lines and create some counterplay with his pieces. Not really what white wants, even though he's still got some ways to come out a little bit better here in the position. So my opponent overlooked this idea. He took the pawn, which is the most natural move in the position, but of course, white is just swarming. He's going to get this back by taking on b7. So rook takes b7, and even though the material is even, you just get the sense that black is running out of good moves. There are not good ways for him to create threats against the white's king, which can always come to g2, and the bishop is securing this diagonal as well as this file. So there's not a whole lot that black can do. My opponent played rook takes b7, and after rook takes b7, now there's threats against f7. So the rook comes to f8 to defend, and I played the move queen f5, threatening mate in 1 and provoking more weaknesses. We're trying to tie down our opponent. g6 is forced to prevent mate, so queen f6 is played, putting more pressure on black's position, threatening maybe sacks on g6 with the bishop, putting pressure on f7, pressure on the knight. And where do you go with black? You can play a spite check to d1 or a1, but after king g2, there's no good follow-ups here. And of course, queen a1, king g2, if you decide to take here on b3, white is just going to continue with their attack, and the knight will be hanging on c6 as well. So knight to d8 is played, moving the knight out of the attack from the queen and the bishop, and threatening the rook. But rook to b8 simply says, okay, I'm keeping the pressure on, I'm threatening your knight, and putting pressure against the rook here. Black's best defense here would probably have been to play knight to e6, allow some trades and allow my queen to get in and gobble up some pawns. Not a very favorable looking line, but instead my opponent played queen e8, trying to hold everything together, and suddenly look at black's pieces all together on the 8th rank. And this makes a very pretty picture for white, a very scary picture for the black pieces. After the move bishop d5, you can see that black is tied in knots. The knight is pinned to the queen. Where can it go? You can't move the knight without losing the queen. You can't move the rook at all. It's just stuck. If the queen moves, it can't go very far because it has to defend this knight, which is attacked twice. So the only square for the queen would be to come to d7. And white is also threatening queen takes g6. So the only way to stop that was the move king h7. And now, with the white pieces, we're looking for one last way to break through here in this position. There are a couple different ways to keep mounting the pressure. I chose to play with the move h4. And the point behind h4 is just you cannot maintain this position with black. Everything is stuck. Everything is tied down and pinned. I'm going to play the move h5 and h takes g6 if I can, trying to create some last little wrenches and threats in this position, and then I can start trading things off at the right moment. And black doesn't have great ways to unwind here. I think the best defense would be to play h5, stopping this idea, though of course then white can just look for his next breakthrough idea. Maybe queen to d6, for example, looks very nice. My opponent tried queen d7, saying, hey, I'm attacking your bishop. Am I going to get out of this? Nuh-uh. c4, simply securing the bishop. The queen is still tied down, nowhere good or active for it to go. And here my opponent tried a very desperate move, overlooking the tactical idea. He played the move queen to f5, and this, of course, is falling apart. This knight is under attack 2 times. We can't take it with the queen because the queen is threatening ours, but after the move queen to d6, forking the knight and the rook, black has no defense, and in this position, my opponent resigned. So what was the key to the success of this game, right? We came off of 4 losses. We finally had a draw. We finally got on the board, starting to get a little confidence back. We're starting to feel our mojo again. And we didn't play a great opening. We were a little bit squandered. Well, the key is never be afraid. Never be afraid to go into some of these lines to find ways to improve your pieces. We looked back at this critical position here. We played knight f5, a temporary pawn sacrifice, not even a full one, but freeing up our pieces. So don't be afraid to challenge your opponent. Offer up those pawns. Get your pieces going, rocking the way you want, and find a way to get active and going on the attack. My biggest way that I say, hey, if you're in that slump, if you haven't been winning games, never slow down. Don't play passive. Try to go on the attack. Try to stay on the aggressive, because if you find yourself on your back foot when your confidence is already a little shaky, that's the worst time to be defending. You don't want to be defending if you don't have confidence in your skills to do so. If you feel a little shaky, do something that's going to get you pumped up, get you energized, go for the gusto, go on the attack, and get yourself going again. So 3 rounds were down, back to 1.5, back to even. Of course, I really wanted to finish on a positive score in this tournament in order to show that I had a nice showing again. And I got the black pieces again, and so what did we get? Well, another French defense was played. This time, rather than a McCutcheon, though, we got the Steinitz variation, and we will go through these moves fairly quickly here. Most of this is book sort of ideas. White is really securing his center and the d4 square, and what White is often going to do in these positions, which you see, is he's going to trade this pawn on c5, and after the trade of a few pieces, White is going to try to occupy the d4 square and set up a blockade here to stifle Black's activity. Black is going to try to expand on the queen side, see if he can get his bishop traded off, and try to make sure that White doesn't start getting any huge attacks going here with things like f5 and g4. For this reason, Black will delay castling for quite a long time in these openings, more often than not. Knight d4 was played, bishop d7, a3, and queen to b6. And queen b6 may not be objectively the best move after a3. There are some ideas of bringing queen to a5 in some lines, though you can't do it right away because of forks, but the point is to prepare ideas like b4 here as well. Knight takes on c6, and this is why we bring our bishop to d7, being able to recapture with the piece. Queen came to d4, and this was our critical position out of the opening here. So far, we've pretty much stayed in book, in a theory, to this point. And at this point, Black has a critical decision to make. What he has to do is choose to either expose the queens to each other with a move like knight a4 or knight d7, or he can continue with his idea of prepping b4 by playing the move a5, or he has to just do something else altogether, like make a move like rook b8 to defend his queen and allow the knight to go somewhere else, or play g6 or castle. There's different ideas he can do, but these are the sort of candidate moves that I was debating between. Do I move the knight to a4 and offer the trade, or what I really wanted to play was the move a5? The problem that I had to a5, and again, I was wrong in my evaluation at the end of the line, but I was afraid of what would happen after b4. I was afraid of the moves a takes b4. Now he can't retake with the pawn because it's pinned. Queen takes b4. And what I was looking at here, what I really wanted to do, is move this knight into the position. I want to play the move knight to e4, right? Or maybe even knight to a6. Simply gaining time on the queen. But after a move like knight a6, I was afraid of this queen coming into d6. It looks kind of nasty. He's putting pressure on my bishop, pinning it to my queen. My king is definitely stuck in the middle of the board. It feels like one more piece and the world might be falling apart, and I've got a lot of pressure against this b5 pawn too, so I'm not sure if I'll be able to sufficiently hold that. But I didn't go deep enough into this position. The problem is this knight is so weak here on e3, and Black has great ways to take advantage of this. For starters, the first thing Black can do is he can simply play rook c8. Rook c8 will defend this bishop so that Black no longer has to worry about the threats of bishop takes after the queen moves. If you don't want to play it right away, you can also go for the line queen e3 check, the point being that you're forking the rook, the knight and the king. White's forced to play knight to e2, and now look how tied down White has become. Again, you can play the move rook to c8, and after this, even though this queen is on d6, White has nothing else he can bring into the attack. And Black is going to be able to move his bishop to d7 or b7, move his knight into the game, continue to mount the pressure, and there's not a good way for White to untangle. His knight is blocking his bishop is blocking his rook, his king can't castle this way. There's no good way for White to deal with this position. If he plays a4, you can always take it, or even play a move like knight to c5. And it simply just does not look very good for the white pieces. All I had to do was find this idea of rook to c8 and suddenly see that White does not have any threats at all. Black is just better, even with this scary queen here on d6. So don't be afraid to look further in these positions. I thought quite a long time here and simply got scared after queen d6. I saw the move queen d6 in these lines and just kind of stopped thinking beyond that. Said, that looks too scary. I don't want to do it. But don't be afraid to rise to the challenge. You cannot play with fear if you want to go for wins in your games. So what did I do instead? Well, after queen d4, I played the move rook to b8. And the point of rook b8 is I'm giving my knight free rein to move again, of course, because I'm defending my queen. And I'm also preparing to play b4 if I get the chance, because now I have two pieces defending this square. My opponent decided to play it first, and after b4 I played the move knight to a4. And the other reason behind rook b8 is if he chooses to take, after the move queen takes b6, I can consider maybe taking with the rook as well. It gives me a second option. And the point is, after rook takes, if he takes my knight and disrupts my pawns, which looks like I'm breaking apart my structure, it's not such a big deal. My rook is defending a6, and my bishop is going to get the b5 square to go to. It actually gives my bishop a nice home on b5. This pawn here on a4 really can't be attacked other than white's light-squared bishop. The rooks have no good access to it. And pawns are only weak if they can be attacked. That's a key thing to remember about these positions. So even though they look isolated and torn apart, which they are, there's no real weakness to them because this bishop will come to b5, and white does not have anything left to target these pieces with the knights off the board. So that was part of my idea. However, my opponent did not choose to trade the queens. Instead, he played knight to e2 in this position. And now that my opponent has played knight to e2, I decided to castle, saying it's time to connect the rooks, and I'm no longer worried about you storming up the board with a kingside attack because you've kind of taken some slow moves. Your bishop's blocked in. There's not a lot of threat going there. You could still play for this sort of thing, but I can always trade the queens off the board. There's not a big mating threat anymore. And here my opponent finally decided to swap the queens off, and I did choose to take with the rook. And my point here was that rather than taking with the knight and rerouting it to c4, which is a nice looking square for the knight, I decided I wanted to maybe play b2 to threaten that. Or maybe my knight's going to come to c3 if his knight goes to d4. I wanted to keep a little bit of flexibility with the knight. Also, sometimes having the rook on b6 can be useful to defend this 6th rank when you play moves like f6, which is another idea that I had in mind here. So knight d4, bishop d7. The point of bishop d7 is not only to move away from the attack of the knight, but also give support for this e6 square with both the bishop and the rook, and slow down any of white's f5's ideas by eyeing through the pawn, the f5 push as well. I really wanted to play the move bishop to e8 and then f6 and bring my bishop out this way, but I was a little worried about allowing white some f5 pushes, so I played bishop d7, the idea of pushing f6, and then once things trade off, then I'll bring my bishop to e8 and reroute it out. White played bishop to d3, and now f6, and here my opponent played a little bit of, I consider it to be an inaccuracy. It doesn't feel like it. It feels like the most natural move in the position. But my opponent castled kingside. And the problem with castling here is that once black takes this pawn here with f takes e5 and f takes e5, now white has three weaknesses. The e5 pawn, the c2 pawn, and the a3 pawn. And even though black's pieces aren't the most coordinated, they're very awkward. The bishop is awkward, the rook is awkward, and the knight is awkward. So certainly you can't say that black is doing better with his pieces, but black is doing better structurally. He has stronger pawns over here compared to white's, and that's what black is trying to prove. He's trying to prove that his long-term structural advantages are stronger than white's piece play. After f takes e5, I played the move rook takes rook and rook takes rook, and this does look awkward for black. Like we said, the rook cuts the king off from being able to come over. Black is no longer contesting the f-file, but his structure is very nice. And what I would like to do now is I'd like to relocate my knight to c5, where from c5 I can attack both a3 and e5. If I get the chance, I would also like to trade off our light-squared bishops. So first I played the move knight b2, and this might be slightly premature in retrospect, when we're looking at the way that the plan plays out, but it's something that really sort of asks white, hey, am I going to take your bishop? Should you be afraid of this trade? It's a move kind of aimed at semi-bluffing, right? Saying, do you need to worry about this capture? I don't really want to make this capture because it will actually help white's structure, and I don't want to have bad bishop versus good knight. Knight b3 was played, looking to bring the knight into the c5 square, and then bishop e8, continuing with our plan. And the point here is that even with the knight on c5, yes, our rook is awkward, but our rook holds both a6 and e6, and it's not so easy for white to find more ways to target these squares. Black is going to play bishop g6 and look to trade off the bishops and then bring his own knight into the game that way. Here was the next big inaccuracy from my opponent, and that was rook to f4. He tried to bring this rook into the game, give it a little bit of scope left and right along the fourth rank, but the problem with this is that it just doesn't achieve very much at the moment. He needs to play a move like knight to c5, increase the pressure immediately, and it allows my idea, bishop g6. Now, you may look at this and say, isn't this weird? Aren't you allowing your pawns to become doubled? And my opponent played this almost instinctively. He played bishop takes g6, allowing h takes g6. And this is the whole point behind black's play. White really does not want to make this trade. Even though black gets doubled pawns, now there's no way of stopping the knight from coming to the c4 square. And once the knight goes there, he really exerts a lot of pressure on white's position. Here I thought white's best move would be the move knight to a5. Again, an awkward looking move, but trying to prevent my knight from coming to c5, simply offering the trade if I do that, and also preventing a move like rook to c6 to build on the c-file, so I probably have to play something like rook b8 and then rook to c8, and it looks pretty even here. Black has to deal with the weakness of his doubled pawns, white has to deal with the weaknesses of his queenside pawns, and honestly, the game is probably even at this point in time. There's still some dynamics to it, but white should be able to just secure things. I mean, he can always drop his rook back to defend c2 if need be. He's keeping my knight out of this square. There's not a good way for black to really create any breakthroughs in this position. So knight a5 would have been a way to create equality, but instead my opponent played the move knight c5. And it's an aggressive move, of course, eyeing both of my pawns, but now I can play knight to c4 in turn, and you can no longer hold all of these pawns. Now it's a much more dynamic game, right? The other way would have led to a static equality. By playing knight c5, white is seeking a dynamic equality instead. Knight to d7 attacks my rook. I played rook c6. And here, I wondered whether or not my opponent might play the move knight to b8 and try to continue to harass my rook, because of course if I go back to b6, we can always just repeat moves, so that would have been an option in this position. And if I don't repeat moves, if he plays knight b8 and I play something like, I don't know, rook to c8, of course he can take my pawn over here, and now we have this sort of pawn race where we're both fighting to get each other's pawns. I'm taking on a3, eyeing c2, and knight to c4 is played, cutting off that diagonal, attacking d6, and we suddenly get this sort of crazy looking game going on the board, much more dynamic and double-edged. I wondered if white might play in this manner or not. Instead, my opponent played rook to f8 check, forcing my king to the h-file, and here again white could play the knight b8 idea, which I think is the most even for him in the position. But my opponent played for more. He went with rook to e8, setting up some knight f8 forking ideas in order to take the pawn on e6. I went ahead and took his pawn on a3. There's not a good way to bring another defender to e6. And here, my opponent made his last mistake, and this really is what tipped the scales and gave me some winning chances here. And he decided to play the move rook takes e6, going all out for this pawn, his point being to create the fork, which looks pretty, but he simply is going to wind up down too many pawns. After king g8, knight takes e6, My knight takes on c2, and after knight c7, knight takes b4, and black is holding the pawns on a6 and d5 for the time being. He has 3 passers on the queen side, and we're in another knight and pawn ending, just like we were earlier. Last time it led to a draw. We want to break through this time. We want to win the game. How are we going to make that happen? Well, for one, we've got 3 passed pawns. That's a big boon to us, even though this knight is probably not going to be able to be maintained on b4, so white should win one back. King f2 is played, king f7, king e3, and here I made the decision to play knight to c6, allowing white to get back one of the pawns, but allowing me to mobilize as well and keep his king from coming to the d4 square. Knight takes a6 was played, b4, moving forward with the pawns. Knight came to c7, attacking my pawn, stopping the king from coming to e6. So d4 check. Moving our pawns forward, we want to create some extra threats here. If it were just these pawns left on the board, white might have some better defending chances, but because there's other pawns as well, black also has the idea of, if I simply win this e-pawn, I can trade off both my pawns and my knight for white's knight, as long as white's king is deflected far enough that I can run over and gobble up his pawns. Then I'll be able to win a king and pawn ending. So this is a much tougher ending for white to defend than the last endgame, which we looked at. Significantly different. King d3 is played, b3 pushing forward, trying to get as much space and keeping that wall against the opponent's king so he can't come over. If the king comes up, b2 can't be stopped. e6 was played from white, king to e7, and knight to a6. And now we enter a nice tactical sequence. A good point, last sort of puzzle of the day. If you've got a moment, pause your videos, look at it. How can white, or black rather, make his last breakthrough, tie white all the way down, and guarantee himself a win in this ending? See if you can take a minute, solve the puzzle, find the last winning idea here. We'll go ahead and show you guys knight to e5. And the point is the king cannot move forward. He cannot capture on d4, or else the b pawn is off to the races. After the king comes to d2, how do we follow up? Knight to c4 check, again attacking the king. If the king comes up, we'll be able to race our pawn forward, so we don't want to allow that if we're white. King goes back to c1, d3 is played, and now white is in desperate straits. Knight c7, his last-ditch attempt to try to bring the knight back into the game, routing it back this way in order to help defend some squares. b2 check is played, king to b1 and d2, and now black is one move away from queening either one of these guys. Going to be very difficult to stop. White's last-ditch effort, knight d5, king takes e6, and knight c3. So now at least the knight is holding both squares, but the problem again, we still have extra pawns on the board, so even if you could manage to hold everything with your king and the knight, my king is going to be able to walk up into the game, gobble up the pawns, and nothing left for white to do about it. King e5 was played, the king comes to c2, king to d4, and in this position, no more way to really hold anything. I think white can just try moving some pawns. There's not a good way to make a king or a knight move without allowing black to further enter the game. My opponent played knight to d1, and now, very easily, knight to e3 will win the game, forcing the knights off the board. You could take the pawn on b2, for example, then bring the king back, but either case, there's no way to keep the game alive for white. Black is going to win, and in this position, my opponent resigned. So those were our games from Atlanta this past weekend. Hopefully, you were able to take some good instructional content out of it. We looked through a variety of different endings, some different openings. The main takeaways that we want to focus on is, hey, when you're not doing too hot, when you're in that slump, when you've been losing your games, keep your head up, right? Don't worry about that. Don't worry about things not always resulting the way you want. Worry about those actual positions. Think about the play and make sure you realize what it is that's causing your games to go wrong. We saw in our first game against Ethan, it was that tactical moment, misevaluating the final position at the end of it. So knowing that gives me something that I can work on. I say, hey, I need to make sure that I'm evaluating at the end of my lines as much as I am at the start. That's something that I'm not doing well enough. So I can take that away, bring it into my other games, and continue to improve. So always walk away looking to improve from your losses. Don't dwell on them too much, and keep the fighting spirit, right? When you're in a slump, how do you get out of it? Well, you got to punch back. It's the only way to do it. So keep your fighting spirit. Don't be afraid to go on the attack, get aggressive, and do what you can to turn things around. So hopefully you've enjoyed everything today. If you have any questions or comments, be sure to leave them below. Subscribe to the channel, like the videos, and wishing you all best of luck. If you enjoyed the video, be sure to like, post any comments, and share via the buttons below. Check out our website at chesswithnick.com for further video, more content, and any postings on lessons, further video analysis, or written analysis that you may be interested in. And be sure to check out our YouTube channel, Chess with Nick, on youtube.com. Have a great day, and wishing you best of luck.